Hello and welcome, my name is Ryan, I'm also known as RM2KDev. Now, this is a new video. I haven't done a video like this before, but today we're going to be talking about AngularJS. I'd like to start off by first saying that I'm not an expert, but I have been using AngularJS now for a couple of months, and I've got quite okay at it. A practical knowledge of AngularJS, I would call it. So this is sort of a video to explain to you guys the problem that I had, and that was coming to AngularJS from a C# developers or ASP.NET developers background, and also developing a practical application inside of AngularJS without any prior knowledge. And so when you first look at AngularJS, you'll be overwhelmed with the amount of new things that you've never heard of, or you may have heard of them, but they're relatively new concepts, like things like two-way binding. I mean, these aren't really new concepts, but things like services and dependency injection. And if you're using ASP.NET, not the MVC version, the traditional classic web forms, or you're coming to this from a JavaScript programmer's background and you're looking for a client-side framework, then these may seem like daunting and new ideas to you. And AngularJS offers a lot of really interesting ways for designing client-side web applications. Now, first off, most of the products that you create in AngularJS are going to be single-page applications. However, with that said, I'm currently working on a tool for my employer in a very small team, and it's basically me and a couple of other developers, and it's a social network. So there's tons of pages and tons of content, and AngularJS has been working fine in that. So when you're thinking about a single page application, it really isn't going to be just limited to a single page, because of the way that Angular works, there are multiple pages contained within one single page at the end of the day. Okay, so let's get started. Some things you're going to need: you'll probably need to have npm installed. npm stands for the Node Package Manager. You can get that very easily by installing Node onto your machine. So once you've got Node on your machine, you're going to need to install Yo, which is YO, and basically Yo is a generator. And by generator, what I mean is it actually generates a lot of code for you, which is really cool. Again, you can install this through npm. You're also going to need Bower, which is a package manager as well, I think. Let me double check that. Yeah, it's a package manager for getting frameworks and JavaScript libraries and things like that into your application. So once you've got these installed, you can create a project using Yo for Angular. Now, there's a generator that I found and I've been using, and it's called CG-Angular or -Angular. And it's a fantastic generator. It allows you to scaffold in things like partials, things like services, and all of the things that directives, all of the things that you use to create your website. And that's another word that might be daunting at first. Think of directives. The best way to explain a directive, a lot of people go into really complicated examples, and they didn't make any sense to me when I was trying to learn Angular. But now that I've actually been using it, I understand a little bit more about what they are. And the easiest way for me to explain it to you is that a directive is basically the same sort of thing as a user control. If you've ever used .NET, if you've ever used ASP.NET, they're basically user controls. So it's a set of HTML and backend code that you reuse in multiple places. So I'm going to create a new folder inside of my AngularJS directory here. So I'm just going to use terminal and navigate to that directory. I'm just going to call this my first Angular app. I'm going to navigate into that, and I'm going to use Yo to create a new project inside of that directory. And we do this just simply by typing Yo CG Angular. Sorry, we need to type sudo because I'm in a folder where it doesn't have permissions. There we go. So the first question is going to ask you a couple of questions, and the first one is, what would you like the Angular app / module name to be? This is going to be the name of your application. I'm just going to call this my first app. Then it's going to ask you if you want to use the standard router or the Angular router. For this project, I'm just going to use the standard Angular router, and that's going to basically download everything that you need and set up a project for you. Okay, so once the process and scripts have finished running, you can open up your directory and you'll see a bunch of files have been created for you. These files are the basis of your Angular project if you're using the generator that I used using Yo. Now, I personally use WebStorm as my main IDE for web projects, so I'm just going to open this directory inside of WebStorm here. I just go to Documents, Angular, my first Angular app, and I'm just going to select that as my directory. Now that's going to open me up with my WebStorm IDE, and you'll see that I've got all of my files here. Now app.js, that is the entry point for your application. So the first thing that you see, like I said, this is a practical application. This is a practical guide to AngularJS, so you don't need to understand what all of this does. Merely understand the concepts behind this. So the first thing that's happening is Angular is defining a module, and this is actually going to be your application, and it's injecting in the things that it needs. It injects these in via a process known as dependency injection. A topic for another day. We don't, again, really need to know what that's doing, but basically, the simplest way to understand dependency injection, especially in AngularJS, is that you can make a function and the parameters, you set them as what you want them to be, and magically they will be populated for you with instances of what you're looking for. So the second thing that happens is your application gets configured. And the things that it uses to configure itself are these route providers. Now, a route provider is basically a way of defining where pages go. So for instance here, there are no routes defined at the moment, but the default route is going to take us to /home. And that's going to be our home page for the application. And the final thing that happens is your module or your application is told that it can now run. The scope is passed into it. Scope is something we'll get into in a little bit as well. It sets up a value called safe apply on the scope, and we don't, again, really need to know how that works, but just know that it's there. And that's pretty much it for the entry point to our application. Now, to start our application using the CG Angular generator, we use a command called grunt, or we use a tool called grunt. Now, if you're in the project, you're able to say in a terminal, grunt serve. Oh, unable to find a local grunt. Did I install grunt? We've got a grunt file here. Grunt serve. Ah, sorry, I haven't installed. All right, so the first thing that you need to do is install your npm module. So sudo npm install. Give it your password, and that's going to go through and download all of the things that your application needs to actually run. So when that's done, I'll come back and show you guys how to run your application. Okay, now that that has successfully installed all of the dependencies that our project needs, we can try that grunt command again. So we type grunt serve. Now what you'll notice is it's now running a server, and that server is running on localhost port 9001. So if you were to open up a tab in your browser of choice, I'm just going to bring up my browser of choice to this screen. There we go. And type in localhost, and the port is going to be 9001. What you'll notice is we will be taken to a route called /home. Obviously, there's nothing here at the moment, but you'll recognize that from this default route provider here at the start of our application inside of app.js. It's redirected us to /home because there was no other routes defined. So the first thing that we need to do is define a page in our application. And using Yo in combination with the CG Angular generator and also in combination with AngularJS, there's a very, very simple way of doing this. And that's simply to type into your terminal Yo CG Angular, then a semicolon, and then we tell it what we want. So what I actually want to do is I want to create a partial. Now a partial is sort of a little mini application that runs inside of your browser. So you're thinking of your browser now as a typical Windows form or a Mac what do you call them on Mac? I can't remember what you call them on Mac. Basically a form, and we're going to inject these little partials into it as we need them. So the first partial I'm going to create one. I'm just going to call it, let's call this partial demo 1. Sorry, we have to say partial and then space demo 1. That's just going to be the name of my partial. And of course, we need to run that as administrator. Now it's going to ask us if we want a route for our partial. And yes, we do want a route for our partial. So the route that I want for this partial, I'm just going to use the /. Then it's going to ask us where we want to create the partial files. So they're going to be created under partial /demo, demo 1. It says partial doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? Yes, I would. And then it creates us a bunch of files. Now, if I just refresh my project tree, you'll see that here. Now on the right hand side here, you'll notice that the route provider automatically updated itself. It says that when we visit this /, we're going to use the template located at partial demo1, demo1.html. And if we navigate in our folder structure to partials demo1, demo1.html, you'll see that we get just some standard HTML with a little bit of Angular syntax on there. Now, Angular follows the model view controller design pattern, MVC. So basically, each of these partials, you can think of them as little applications, where each application contains its own set of logic, its own set of views, which are going to be the way that it's displayed onto the screen, and its own testing frameworks, as well as its own CSS and various other things. And the way that we link this HTML file to a specific JavaScript file is using this controller. So you'll see that the controller is set as demo1ctrl, which just stands for controller. If we have a look at the JavaScript file that was put in here alongside our HTML file, you'll see that it's an Angular, again, it's Angular syntax. First of all, it tells us that we're working in the module of my first app, because that's the application that we're working in. And it tells us that we want to create a controller, and the name of the controller is demo1ctrl. So anything we put inside of here is going to exist for this partial only. Hope that makes sense. So yeah, basically we now have this demo controller. I'm going to add something in here just to say h1 hello, like that. So now when we visit according to our routes /, we should be taken to partial demo 1. If we visit anywhere else, we'll be taken to /home. So let's just have a look at our application and see if that's worked. And one thing you'll also note, because we're using Grunt to run our website, we don't actually have to keep stopping and starting our project. Grunt is actually sitting there looking for files that change and automatically rebuilding that project and getting it ready for you to use straight away. So if I visit the /, you'll see now that we get a hello on the screen. That's fantastic. That means that our controller is set up and it's working. Now I'm going to show you guys something quite cool. And this is where Angular starts to become really powerful. I'm just going to have a drink of water because I'm quite thirsty. Sorry about that. Okay, so understanding this concept that we have a view and a controller. Basically what that means is the controller is controlling the view. The controller is giving data into this view, and this view is able to consume that data. And the way it does that is through something that they both share. And the thing that it shares is a scope. Now, a scope, if you think of a scope like a microscope or a telescope or something, it's something that looks at a small portion of something larger. Now, the scope in this instance is going to relate specifically to demo1.html because we're dealing with the scope inside of demo1 controller. Now, if I were to say something like scope, now because this is just plain JavaScript, I can attach anything I want to this. So I'm going to say my name is going to be equal to, oh, I spelled name wrong. That's a bad start. It's going to be equal to Ryan, aka RM2KDev. Now I just stuck my name on the scope. And in doing that, I've now made my name available to demo1.html. And this is where Angular comes in with some of its really interesting syntax and the way that it works with the pages. So I can just simply type in a double brace, so opening brace and a closing brace, and then another one. And in the middle of that, type in my name. Now, automatically, AngularJS is going to go into that scope, and it's going to look for something named exactly the same as this on that, exactly the same as this on the scope object, and replace this section with what it found. So I'm just going to jump into the application again, and if I refresh the page, you now see hello Ryan, aka RM2K Dev. That's pretty cool. That actually is quite interesting. It's a different way of designing. You basically get to template. This is called view templating, by the way. We're actually creating a template. Our view is simply a template, and our controller provides the data to that template. So we can do some other interesting things here as well. We can start to ask questions, and we can use this thing called two-way binding. So I'm just going to type H1. So it's H2. And I'm just going to say, what's your... That's the wrong your name. That's also the wrong your. There we go. What's your name? Question mark. And just on the side of that, I'm just going to say input, and I'm going to make that a type of text box. Was it text or text box? I can't remember. Basic HTML. My apologies. Let's have a look at that. Refresh the page. There we go. What's your name? So yeah, it's text. Right. And then just below that, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to say H3, your name is, and then in the curly braces again, I'm going to say your name. Okay. Now currently this doesn't exist on the scope, and my IDE is intelligent enough to know that, and it hasn't highlighted. It's actually telling me unresolved variable, and basically that means it wasn't able to find it. So in the background, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come into the scope, and I'm going to add a variable called your name. But for now, I'm just going to set it as a undefined, just so that it exists, but it's not actually anything at the moment. Now this is where Angular gets even more interesting. We can actually use this thing called two-way binding to bind the value of this text box to that variable that's sitting on our scope. And we do this with a model. We say ng model, it's going to be equal to your name. I spelled your as well with an E. There we go. That's going to be equal to your name. Now if we go back to our web page and refresh just to have a look what's happening here. What is your name? You'll see some magic happening. As I type into this text box, my name is automatically going into the scope, saving itself onto that variable, and then automatically rebinding itself into the H3 tag that we've placed underneath the text box. And as I change this variable infinite times, you'll see that our name automatically updates. And that's just one of the really cool things that AngularJS has. But let's go more than that. Let's add a little bit of logic to our view. Let's say that we don't want this to appear until a name has been entered into this text box, because your name is and then blank is a little bit weird. We can achieve that in Angular using something really simple, just called an ngIf. And you'll notice something starting to repeat itself here. These ng commands, they stand for Angular, I think, or it's the sound Angular, ng. So ngIf is basically a conditional statement for a HTML element. So what I'm saying here in this line is I only want to display the contents of this H3 tag if these conditions are met. And those conditions are that your name is not undefined. Basic JavaScript. So your name not equals undefined. There we go. So undefined is going to be our test. If your name is undefined, which it is by default, because I've said it's undefined, until you change it, it's going to stay undefined. So if I refresh the page, you'll notice that that section, that H3 tag doesn't appear on our page. And then as I start typing, I'm going to be changing that variable to a point that now it is defined with whatever the contents of this text box is, and that H3 tag should just magically appear. Your name is hello. Magic, see? And that's some really basic AngularJS tags, but let's go a little bit further than this. I'm going to take this tutorial somewhat, like I said, this is a very informal tutorial, nothing scripted here. I just want to show you some reasons why you could be using AngularJS and some cool things that it can do. So, along the lines of generating in our partials, which we've covered, we can also generate these things called services. Now, let's say you've got data stored somewhere on a server, or you want to consume an API, or do one of many things that involves persistent data or persisting data back and forth between your application and a database. Sorry, I'm just gonna have a drink again. Sorry guys, I'm really thirsty today. So yeah, you want to persist some data back and forth, or you want to consume some data, or you want to, I don't know, you want a place to store some information and do some stuff. You're going to want to use a thing called a service. Now, a service offers you a way to integrate with things that are outside of your application. It also offers you a way to reuse chunks of code. And the way I'm going to demonstrate this, I'm going to create a service, and we're going to use the generator again. That's the CG Angular generator that sits on top of Yo. So I'm going to say sudo Yo CG Angular, and this time I want to say service. And I'm going to call this service, let's think of a good name for this. I'm going to call it my games. Games is a good name. It's going to call it games. There we go. It's going to ask us where we'd like to create it. Yes, we would like to create it in the service folder. Service doesn't exist. Yes, we should create it. And now it's created our service. Okay, so if I refresh my project tree, just like that, you'll see our service folder has magically appeared. And now we have these two folders. I should also mention that the -spec file, that is a testing framework, which we're not going to be covering in this video. However, it is worth noting that AngularJS does come with a unit testing framework, which is pretty cool. I haven't seen too many other full stack frameworks that cover everything from your basic view to your services and your directives, or user controls, as well as handling your testing framework for you as well. It's quite a nice framework to work with. So we're just going to ignore those files for now. But yeah, just so you know, they're a testing framework, and long story short, a testing framework is there to validate that your code is working. So if you're working on a larger project with multiple people, you'll start to write some things like in tests, and they're written in English, like it should, and then do something, and then expect a result. And if that is true, the testing framework will pass. If it's false, the testing framework will fail, and you'll know that you have a bug somewhere inside of your code. But that's a video for another day. So inside of our service, you'll see that it returns us, it basically creates us a factory, okay, which is our service, on our module, which is my first app, named games, and it basically sets up a very small object here, and it returns that object to us. So let's change this around a little bit so that we get something more useful out of it. What I want to return from this service is an array. So I'm going to use square brackets, and it's going to be an array of games that I own. So the first thing we're going to use, I'm going to use a JSON notation here, and I'm going to say name. The name of this game is going to be Destiny. Yes, I have been playing Destiny. I am not super high level yet. I am only level 14, but it's a pretty good game so far. Having a good time with it. So the name is Destiny, and the publisher, or the developer is going to be, Bungie. Okay, so we're going to add another game. Let's add name Pokemon, and the developer is going to be Game Freak. And you can see sort of what we're doing here. We're defining some data. Now this data is just going to be simulation data. I'm just pretending that this is the data that came back from our server. Our database was storing the names of games that I owned and the developers that they came from. And you would place your requests or your resources, as Angular calls them, inside of your service. And that's where this data would come from. So I'm going to add another game. I can't think of any other games. Battlefield, I'm just going to say BF3. And developer, I actually have no idea who makes that game. Who makes Battle? It's DICE, I think. DICE. spelled like that, or I don't know how to spell. I'm just gonna write dice, like regular. All right, so basically our server sets up a basic table of information, and it returns that table of information to us. You might be asking yourself, well, how do I get that service into my application, and how do I use it, and what could I use it for? And this is where dependency injection comes in. So the first thing that you saw with this function that defines our scope is that it's actually just injected straight in as a parameter of this function. Now, Angular behind the scenes automatically works out which scope to inject and injects it. And in the same way, we can literally just say in our function declaration that we want game, or games as I called it. We want games. So when I run the application, Angular is going to go, oh, well, this function is looking for scope and it's looking for games. Do I have those available? Yes, I do. Inject them. And so those now become available inside of this function. To demonstrate that, I'm just going to do a console.log, and I'm going to log games. Okay. Now, if this works successfully, games will be injected, and it's going to be a reference to this service, which is returning an array of JSON objects in this format back. So what we should receive at the other side of this is this array here. Now, if I open up my console in my browser and I refresh the page, you'll see that we received 3 objects. If I expand those objects, developer Bungie named Destiny, Game Freak Pokemon, and Dice Battlefield 3. So that service has been successfully injected into our demo page. Now on our demo.html, I'm just going to add a few more tags just so that we can identify what this page is. Say demo 1 page. Okay, and that's going to be so that when we create another page in a second, we'll know which page that we're on. I'm going to get rid of my my name stuff because I don't need that anymore, because I'm going to show you guys this next thing. And we're just going to do a standard HTML unordered list. Now the first list item I want to create, I'm just going to say test, something like that, just so you can see that it's working. And so we get a demo page with an unordered list, and it just says test. Now here's where Angular and its client-side view logic, I don't actually know what the technical term for this is, but it's basically logic that happens on the view in conjunction with the controller. So our controller has got this list of games, and we know that our scope is shared between the page and the controller. So technically, we could put this list of games onto the scope and then use them to display this unordered list. Very simply, in fact, all we would need to say is scope.games, and we don't need to call it games, we could call it scope.games from service. It doesn't matter what it's called, that's just going to be how we access it. Scope.games is equal to games. Now what this is saying is that we're going to create a variable on the scope called games, and it's going to contain the results. Sorry about that. It's going to contain the results from this dependency that was injected, which is the games service, which returns us these games. So now that we have our games on the scope, which means that they're accessible inside of this page, we can use another one of those Angular tags, and this one's going to be called ngrepeat. ngrepeat. And what this does is it repeats a section of HTML. It's basically saying, I want to repeat this line of HTML under the conditions that are set inside of our double quotes, or our quotes here. Now the syntax for this is, we need something to represent each item as it's iterated through the array. So I'm going to call this game. So that's going to be the game that we're talking about. And it's going to be in the list of games that was supplied to the scope. So remember, games is available on the scope. So we're basically saying, for every game inside of the games folder, inside of this array, games, I want you to repeat this line of code. And what we should see if we refresh our page is 3 instances of game, or 3 instances of test, because we have 3 objects in our service. Now you might be thinking, oh, well, that's pretty cool, but this is where it gets even better. We can start to say things now like the name of the game, and then we can say game, and because this is JSON, this game object represents the current game in the loop. So we're looping through this array for as many as there are. So there's 3. So the first time it passes through, game is going to be equal to the first game, which is, Destiny. The second time it repeats, game is going to be equal to the second game, which is this one. And the third time it repeats, and so on and so forth. So now we can say name is going to be game.name, because we know that the name is going to be there because it's on the object. Name is Destiny. Sorry, that needs to be inside of those curly braces. So game.name. And what Angular is going to do, because we're using curly braces, these things here, and we're also using a value that it knows about, it's going to take this name variable and it's going to replace this whole section with that name. So if I refresh the page, you should see something like this. Name Destiny, name Pokemon, name Battlefield 3. If we add something like developer, and then we can do the same syntax again, game.developer, and refresh our page, what you'll see, name Destiny, developer Bungie, name Pokemon, developer Game Freak, name Battlefield 3, developer DICE. And this is where some of the really cool power of AngularJS is coming in. But it doesn't end there. There's so much more to this framework, and this is really just scratching the surface. And I'm making this video just to show you some of the simple things that you can do. And the best thing that I found was this CG Angular, because it actually generates a lot of the boilerplate that you would otherwise need to memorize. I mean, it's not too hard to memorize this syntax. After using this template for the last couple of months, I can pretty much write this on my own now. But it's good to have it there, and it's good to be able to just simply and very efficiently just create a partial, or just create a route, or create a service, and know that all of those things are going to be handled appropriately and stored efficiently. So now we have one partial on our application, and it's consuming a service, and this service is returning to us a list of games, and we're displaying them on our page. But what if we wanted to use our service somewhere else? And this is where dependency injection becomes a key player inside of the AngularJS workflow. We can simply create another page, another partial, inject the service into that partial, and consume that data in a different place. So if you have data that you want to share across multiple pages, put it in a service. I'm going to demonstrate that just by creating another page. So I'm going to say yo CG Angular. It's going to be a partial, and I'm going to call this one demo 2. It's going to ask us if we want a route. We do want a route for this one, but this time we don't want it to be slash. I want this one to be slash demo 2. It's going to ask us where we want to create the files. I'm going to say yes to that, and it's going to create those files in that folder. Now, if I just refresh my tree, you'll see now we have a demo 1 and a demo 2 folder. All the meanwhile in the background, Yo is actually handling for us our index.html file. It's automatically adding in the references to the files that we need. It's automatically handling our views for us. It's automatically using Bower to inject the components that we're using. It automatically comes with Bootstrap 3, so you can. This is all Bootstrap. That's why it looks quite nice, not just like basic HTML. So all in all, everything seems to be working quite well. Let's go into our demo2.html, and I'm just going to copy our demo 1 page just for now. And I'm going to change that just to say demo 2 page so that we know what it is. And I might just get rid of this. Yeah, I'll get rid of the URL for now because we don't need it. Not for this demo. So we've got the first page. Now we need a second page. And simply, just like HTML, I'm going to add an anchor tag. href is just going to take us to slash demo 2 because that was the route that we used. And inside of that, I'm going to say visit second page. Not page. There we go. Not page, page. There we go. Now, AngularJS automatically takes over your anchor tags. And in doing that, because this is a single page application, you only receive this index.html file. Everything that happens on the client side. So when a person navigates from the first partial to the second partial, there is no traditional request to a server. The server generates the page, and then the server sends you back the page, and then the client browser renders it. It's all already on the client's browser. AngularJS takes over the anchor tags, translates them into JavaScript magic in the background, and it hides the current view and shows the next view, and it's instantaneous. The page loads are instant. There is no delay in the loading of these pages. So on our second page, I'm just going to add a anchor tag. href is going to be taking us back to the root, which is just slash. And I'm just going to say go back home. Now to demonstrate the speed of these anchor tags, I'm just going to render the page by refreshing. Then I'm going to select visit second page, and it's going to error. And I'm going to find out why it's going to error quickly, because that shouldn't be happening. Slash demo2 takes us to slash demo2. That's right. I wonder if I needed to put the slash. Sorry, I think I got that wrong. Maybe no slash. Let me double check. No. Might need to put hash slash. Refresh. Ah, there we go. Sorry about that. I needed to put the hash in front of it to tell it that Angular was going to take care of this. So I'm going to do that to the second page as well. It's going to be hash and then slash. I think if we were using HTML5 mode, we wouldn't need to worry about that. As a matter of fact, let's enable that right now and give that a test. So back in our route provider, I think we can type something like route provider.html5 mode, and then in brackets we say true. I'm pretty sure that enables what we're looking for. Don't think it did, actually. I will have to check that out and make an amendment to this video to enable that. Anyway, back to the topic. For the moment, we'll just use the hash and then the forward slash. So hash, forward slash, and then your route. So to demonstrate how fast those page loads are, I will simply click visit second page, and instantly it takes me to the second page. Go home, instant. It's instant. There's no delay here. There's no request to a server. The server doesn't have to generate a page. It just happens instantly. Now, to demonstrate our service being reusable, so if this was actually some realistic data that we were using in a realistic project, and we had multiple areas we wanted to consume that data, in Angular we wouldn't have to rewrite those parts of code multiple times. We would simply move it out into a factory or a service that does what we need it to do and returns those values. So in our second page, we can do the same thing. We can simply request to have games injected into our controller. Then we can pass those onto the scope. So I can say scope.games equals games. Now our second page has access to those games. And to demonstrate this, I'm going to do this a little bit differently. I'm going to make a div. And I'm going to put an ngrepeat on this div. And I'm going to say game and games like I did before. So now this chunk of code here is going to repeat itself. Now I'm going to place a span. I'm just using this to show you guys that this is going to actually repeat out multiple HTML elements. Actually, you know what? I'm not going to use a span. I'm going to use a H1. No, I'm not going to use a H1. I'm going to use a H3. And I'm going to say name. And just underneath that, I'm going to say, yeah, I'm just going to say inside of my quotes, game.name. Then I'm going to add a line break. This is just to show you guys that the templating is actually going to work with HTML. So this entire section of HTML will be repeated multiple times. Now if I say H3, and I'm going to say developer, and then I'll simply say game.developer. And we'll put a line break at the end of that as well. There we go. Now if I refresh this page, visit the second page, you'll see that we've got our games listed horribly because that was a terrible design choice. If you work at a company and you make design choices like that, then don't expect to work there for very long. But you'll see that we have the same data that's actually been used in a different way on another page. So we've got the exact same data, working its magic in two places in Angular, and it was extremely easy to pass that data around. In the same way, that I showed you that the pages can manipulate a variable on the scope, we can actually persist that information back into a service. So if I were to bind, excuse me, if I were to bind the name of the game on the second page, so let's change this from demo2 page to edit games, for instance. If I were to create an input box here, so type equals text, and use our ng model like we did before to bind it to game.name, now we should have this reference from the HTML element on the page back to the scope variable, which using JavaScript's by reference allocation of objects, we will be referencing this games, which actually takes us back to the service. In theory, if I'm correct, we should be able to edit the name of the game, see the name editing on the right hand side here, and move back, and the game will have updated itself in our first page. And again, if we do the same thing with our developer, for instance, if we add a HTML form element and bind that to developer and refresh our page, I think we can get rid of the console now. You'll see that we're now able to edit both the name and the developer. And just for visibility, what I'll do is I'll just add a horizontal rule. This is really horrible CSS, I know. Sorry, HTML. But just so that you can see them separated, I'll add that in there. So the name of this game is going to be Ryan's Cool Game, and the developer is going to be RM2K Dev. Now, if I go back, you'll see that that has now changed to Ryan's Cool Game, developer RM2K Dev. If we go forward to the second page again, we can edit this again, change the developer, and go back, and you'll see that those changes continuously persist back through. And that's because when we make changes, we're actually pushing those changes, or Angular is pushing those changes directly back into the service. Now, this is where Angular gets quite interesting. Traditionally, in a regular forms-based application, if you wanted to create this edit page and you wanted to add a new game to the list, you would have to go through a whole lot of jQuery and binding to the DOM and injecting elements to the page to get it to work. And this is something where Angular seems to shine. So let's add another. I'm just going to use an anchor tag for this again because I'm not going for best design here. I'm just going to show you the functionality. And I'm going to add a, let's just add add game, for instance. Okay. And we'll get rid of our href so that it doesn't do anything. I think just hash leaves it as a blank. We'll test that. If that doesn't work, we'll change it. Yeah, so that didn't work. So we'll change it from just hash to just nothing. We'll refresh the page and see if that works. There we go. So that's now doing nothing because we haven't asked it to go anywhere. I'll tell you what, I'm just a little bit OCD about that. I'm going to add another line break. There we go. Now that we've got this thing, we can use another one of those Angular tags, and this one is going to be ngclick. So when we click this, I want to actually call a function that I'm going to put on the scope, and I'm going to call this function add game, and I'm going to put parentheses on the end because we're going to add a game. Now in demo2.js, we need to add that function to the scope. So I'm going to say scope.add game. It's going to be equal to a function, and that's all we're going to do for the moment. We're just going to say console.log hello, just so that we know that when we click on this button here, it's actually going to be making those changes. We'll inspect the elements just to see what's happening. Go to the console, select add game, and you'll see the word hello is now appearing every time I click it. Now, if you remember to how we generated this form was automatically generated for us. It was bound with an ngrepeat, and it was repeating all of the items of the array that came from games. Now, in the same way that when we modify a variable on the scope, which is, for instance, this one here, I don't know what I was trying to type there, but when we modify something here, it automatically updates. If we were to say inject another blank game into our database, or not our database, into our scope, sorry, not our scope, into our service, then you would expect that another entry would be replicated onto the page automatically for us. So let's do that, but let's do that in a really nice way. Let's refactor a little bit here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to return another object, and I'm going to say data, and it's going to be equal to games. And I'm going to also return models, and that's going to be equal to models. There we go. And that's all I'm going to return for now. And I'm just going to add another variable up here called models. This is just my personal way of programming. You're welcome to change this and improve on this, but this is just something that I like to do. And inside of models, this is going to have, it's going to be a JSON object, sorry, not an array. So let's make a JSON object. And the first thing I want to add to my models is new game. That's going to be a function, and it's just going to return a blank game. So we're just going to say name, it's nothing, and developer, it's nothing. There we go. So whenever we call games.models.newGame, because this is how it links together, we're going to return a blank game. I might need to angular.copy, I think it is. Yeah, we need to copy this because by default JavaScript JavaScript moves your variables around by reference rather than by creating a copy of them. So if I were to create a new game, change it, and then create another new game, it would automatically work that out and start two-way binding it in multiple places, and it would be bad. So I'm just going to make a copy of this, and this is going to be our model for new game. Now if I save this and go back to our demo2.js, which is just over here, instead of saying games equals games.games, we need to say games.data now, because that's our data. It's no longer stored in just games, it's now games.data. And you can see that if you look at this, data resolves to games, which gives us this list here. Models resolves to models, which gives us this object here. Now in demo1.js, we need to do the same thing. So I'm just going to say data. And if I save that, both of these should still be working fine. And they are. As expected, both of these are working fine. But now that we have this model on the scope, in the service, we are able to go to our addGame function. And we should be able to say something like games.data.push, because it is an array, games.models.newGame. And that's a function. So we want to push an object into the array, and that object is going to be a copy of what we defined inside of our service, which was a blank game. Now, if this works properly, what you would expect to see is when we add this game, a blank entry appears. And in this entry, we could say my new game, developer, test game, developer. And because our service is shared across both of these pages, and this data now exists in the service, if we went back to our first page, you would now see that my new game appears in the list. If I went back to the second page, add another game, it's going to call this add another game, 2, 3, like that. And then if we go back to our home page, all of this data still exists. And on the other side of that coin, it's very easy to delete things, because all you need to do is take them out of the array. You just splice this object out of the array by its index, and suddenly it's gone. Persist that back into your database, and the data is just no longer there. It's gone. So this has just been some very simple, well, not simple, but intermediate, I suppose, introduction to how I personally use AngularJS. And like I said, I'm not an expert at AngularJS. I don't claim to understand everything about Angular, but these are some of the constructs that took me a little while to understand. What a directive is, I haven't explained that or gone into that yet. That might be a future video if there's enough requests on this video. But basically, long story short, directive is a user control. It's a series of code and HTML that you want to use in multiple places, and you can do so by defining your own HTML language, essentially. So for instance, in this social network that I'm working on for my company, we have avatars. And the avatar is a directive because it's something that gets used in so many places. It's used in the top left to show your face. It's used on every comment you make. It's used on every post that you make. It's used on every single thing that you do. So instead of rewriting it in multiple places, we created a user control, or as Angular calls them, a directive. And we simply type in our HTML now, wherever we like to use it, avatar, just like that. And we can pass data into it. We can say stuff like user ID equals whatever, and that will automatically be replaced with the directive, and the directive will automatically get this user ID and do whatever it needs to do in the background to actually get that avatar onto the screen. So that's just a brief overview of a directive. There are so many things that you can go into with AngularJS, so I can't cover everything in this one video, but hopefully that was enough of an introduction, and it was clear enough to show you some of the things that aren't clear in other videos. So I did have a lot of trouble when I was looking for tutorials on AngularJS. I couldn't find people who were explaining things in English, if that makes sense. So I hope I've done a good job of explaining all of this in English. If you liked this video, please like the video and subscribe to my channel. Share it with any other developers that you know. And yeah, just keep experimenting with Angular, because it seems to only be getting better. It's backed by Google. It's being used by heaps of big companies now, in conjunction with Node.js, which I do have a video on my channel on how to install that. And you would have had to install that anyway to get NPM when you started this video, so now's as good a time as ever to go and have a look at that. And try expand this. Try go into the service and replace this with something that actually gets data from a server, because you'll find that it works quite well. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. Hope you've enjoyed this video. Like, favorite, subscribe, comment. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. I'll try to reply to them like I usually do. You can find me on Twitter. It's at rm2kdev. That's rm2kdev. Yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks guys. Bye.